Hey, welcome back to the How to Podcast series. It's Dave with you, 287. How active listening could negatively impact your podcast interviews. We got to leave room for a guest, everyone. Glad to have you here. Excited to be back for another episode. I've been working with some clients around helping them with their interview skills. Now, interviewing doesn't come naturally to everyone. I have an HR background, which helps me a lot in that I've actually gone to school to learn how to do an interview. Now, this is more job-based, but the skills and talents that I learned in class really translate well into a podcast interview in that it helps me to understand how to direct the conversation, how to lead the conversation instead of being led by my guest. And there's one big thing that I notice a lot of podcasters early on in their journey as a host interviewing a guest on their show that seem to be good in the moment, but actually are not. They're actually something that's maybe hurting your podcast. And I wanted to talk about it here to help you to be better and grow and be aware of maybe something you might be doing in your podcast that's not giving you the results that you were hoping for. So here on the podcast, we're going to be talking about it, how active listening could be actually hurting your podcast. So here we go. So I found this clip on YouTube. I'll put a link in the show notes so you can go watch it yourself. But we have a guy trying to get logged into his computer at work, and IT sends someone to his desk to help him. And this is what I'm talking about. This illustration's perfect because this is what I'm hearing with podcasters where active listening has a component of where you're supposed to be actively engaged with the person speaking when you're the listener and giving them affirmation and encouragement and coaching and, cheering them on as they explain, and you're right there with them, and you get to the point where it's almost a verbal joust going on between the host and the guest and the host. And as a listener, this is so distracting and so hard to try to concentrate and figure out what's being said here. And if you do this, I'm asking you to, well, A, listen to your own podcast and see if you do this. But B, if you hear this and you're like, oh my gosh, that's what I do, then we need to work on a plan on backing away from this over a period of time so that your guest has the ability to speak freely without you chiming in every split second with your thoughts, comments, and affirmations. Your guest doesn't need that kind of coaching and encouragement. They're fine. And you need to be quiet as the host and let your guest talk. Feels very weird to do it, but as you get practice in this, as you get comfortable leading and letting your guests speak freely without you having to speak over them, like you're going to hear right now, you will have a better experience for your listener, for your guest, for you. And I think you'll see some improvement. So here's the example for your reference, and then I'll be back after this. Here we go.
Hey, Murph. Hey, Ronathan. I heard you're having trouble with your computer.
Yeah, thanks for coming down.
Okay, so what seems to be the problem?
So every time I try to get online, it's asking me for an admin password, but it shouldn't need a password to get onto the internet, and I should already have admin privileges on this computer.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
So one thing I've learned early on as a manager is when I would come into the room or whatever up to people working on a project, and I would walk in as the manager to save the day and step in and see how my team was doing. All the work stopped. Everything got put on hold as they acknowledged my presence in the room and answered the question or caught up on the weekend. And after I left, it took them a considerable amount of time to get back into whatever they were working on. So I noticed early on as a manager in like a corporate environment that if I did less of that, my team was more productive. It didn't interrupt them with casual conversations. And I found my team was more productive. As we do our podcasts, one thing I want you to think about as an interviewer, when your guest is answering a question, if you want them to be productive and get to the point and complete their thought, don't interrupt them. Don't step into the conversation and redirect them. Don't do that. Allow your guest to do the thing that they're there to do, and that's to share their wisdom, their knowledge, and to support you as a podcaster by being on your show. The less interactions you do and interruptions you do to your guests while they're talking, the better the quality of the conversation will be for everyone, including your listener. And we're going to talk about some more of these ways that we step in the way of our guests here on the podcast. Here we go.
Did you get all that?
Yeah, totally. So, you need admin privileges?
No.
Yeah.
I already have admin privileges.
Oh, okay.
I just need to get on the internet. And I shouldn't need admin privileges.
Yeah, got it.
So active listening techniques commonly used in everyday conversations don't always translate well into podcast interviews for several reasons. First of all, audio distractions. When we are constantly verbally affirming our guest as the host with things like, yeah, I love that. That's great. Ooh, good point. That's awesome. Really? Oh, interesting. I find that very interesting. Wow. All of these things that you say over top of your guest while they're trying to complete a thought can be a huge distraction, mostly for your listeners, as they're trying to listen to your guest answer your question, and the less you talk over your guest, the better. Active listening outside of a podcast is good when you use these affirmations because it shows that you're engaged with the person speaking. But that doesn't translate to podcasting. So please stop speaking over top of your guest. As well, it can also cause your guest some discomfort in that your frequent interruptions or interjections, they actually might derail your guest and help and make them lose track of their thoughts, which then now the whole answer is off the rails and we don't even know where we're going anymore, which can lead to tangents. As well, when you are in there interrupting your guest or talking over your guest, there's an unnatural flow to the conversation. Overuse of verbal cues can make the conversation kind of feel forced, unnatural, and really potentially impact the quality of your interview with your guest. To be a better podcast host, we need to create a better interview experience and consider some of the following approaches.
I feel like you're not actually listening to me.
Yeah, sure.
Are you actually not listening to me, or are you saying that you get that it seems that way?
Totally, yeah, that makes sense.
So 3 things here that can help you in this process and make your interview experience better. Number 1, use nonverbal cues when recording your podcast and interviewing your guest. When you're interviewing your guest, use these visual cues like nodding, smiling, maintaining eye contact to show engagement without interrupting the audio. These nonverbal cues are really important. And it allows you to say nothing and say everything at the same time. A picture's worth 1,000 words. You being quiet while your guest is talking is also worth 1,000 words. And you can simply nod it and be a part of the conversation. It works great when you're doing a visual video episode recording, even if you don't use the video, using Zoom, which is what I use, or Riverside, or StreamYard, or all blah, 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 all these other ones. When you're on camera with your guest, speak less, give them space to talk without talking over them, and use these visual, nonverbal cues to kind of keep the conversation going and show your engagement as a listener while your guest talks. Number 2 is to practice silent, active listening. Silent, active listening is what we should be doing as podcasters, where we focus intently on what the guest is saying without feeling the need to interrupt and interject and verbally respond to every single thing they say.
Okay, you need to stop that.
Okay, doing what?
You need to stop checking in with me so much saying yeah. You need to stop saying yeah.
What do you mean?
It seems like you're not listening and that
it.
you're just focusing on saying and
that
got
makes
it and
sense.
everything. Like you took some kind of active listening class, but you're not actually paying attention.
Totally. Yeah, no, I don't think so.
Then why did you disagree with me a million times while I said it?
Okay, yeah. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm just showing you that I'm listening to you.
This allows you to pick up on the nuances and helps you to formulate thoughtful follow-up questions because you're actually listening to your guest. The one thing that really annoys me when I watch like a live podcast recording or a streamed podcast recording is watching the host of the show pose a question to the guest, and then you can see them on their computer like answering email or playing Pokemon. I don't know what they're doing. They're totally not even like looking to their guest on camera. They've totally changed their focus to something else. They look at their phone. They're doing something else in the moment, and you can tell they have no idea what the guest is talking about. They're not even looking at the guest on camera, and you can tell they're not focused on it to the point where they'll actually come back and go, "Oh, okay, yeah, good answer." So, and then they'll ask the exact same question again or rephrase it. And the guest is like, "I just answered that question. What do you do?" What? So focus on your guest when they're talking. This is not time to catch up on your email or to check your stocks or to see if that package is coming from Amazon. This is your time with the guest. And if you don't focus on your guest, your audience won't focus on the guest. And your guest is going to leave that experience going, "What just happened?" So please practice silent, active listening. It really does help when you're engaged with your guest as they're answering your questions. And then the last part is to ask some clarifying questions of your guest. Instead of using constant affirmations like I do on my show, I'll say, "I love that," or "Good point," or "Wow, that's great." Those are things that I'm putting in as little gap fillers as I'm going to the next thing. It's like the step between the first step and the third step. You kind of put something in the middle to get to the next part. You're putting in these affirmations, these things just fall out of your head as words, and you don't even realize in the moment you're saying them as often as you are. So please be aware of them and see if you can try to pull those back a little bit. But ask clarifying questions. Use well-timed clarifying questions to dive deeper into what they just said. It's not like you ask one question, they answer, and then you move to the next question. There might be something they've said that makes you want to go deeper with your guest. Leverage those opportunities and be aware that there's a gold mine in front of you that you can mine and you can bring something out in the conversation. I watch a lot of these shows like Gold Rush and all these things where they're looking for gold. And the one thing I know when I watch Gold Rush on TV is they say you have to wash a lot of rocks to get the gold. They put a lot of dirt, a lot of rocks, a lot of stuff through the gold plant as they process the rocks and stuff. And at the end, they end up with fine little powdery gold, some nuggets, but really fine, really powdery little pieces of gold. But they wash a ton of rocks to get to the gold. And for you as a host of your show, you're going to wash a lot of rocks in your conversation to get to the point where the gold is there for your audience. That nugget, that moment where it's like, oh my gosh, the heavens parted, the angels sing, all the birds come out, it's sunny. And in the conversation, you bring this piece out from your guest that just makes your listener fall in love with the guest, fall in love with you, and fall in love with the podcast. You got to wash a lot of rocks to get to the gold. So ask some clarifying questions of your guests. They just answered your question, and then say something like, "Well, what did you mean when you said this in your answer?" Or, "Can you give me like an example of that? Like, have you worked with a client and helped them to solve that problem? How did it go?" Or ask something like, "Well, how did you feel in that moment when you lost your job? Like, what was going through your mind? Like, well, who are you thinking of in that moment? You just went to another spot in the conversation that goes beyond the initial answer to your first question. So ask these clarifying questions. They really do help.
So you have a problem with your dog, is what I'm hearing?
No, you're clearly not listening to me. Just shut up. Shut up.
Okay.
Shut up.
Sure.
Shut up.
Sure.
Shut up.
Yeah.
Shut up.
Okay.
Shut up.
Okay, sure.
So to be a better podcast host and to serve our guest and our audience, we're going to use nonverbal cues more often than speaking over our guests. We're going to practice silent active listening. We're going to ask better clarifying questions and go deeper with our guests. But what else can we do to create a great space for a great podcast with our guests? A few things to consider, things that I'm doing in my show that I'd love for you to consider for your own podcast. How about creating a comfortable environment? Simply just do something that ensures that the recording space is welcoming and well prepared. You know your tech, you know your gear, you know how to use the recording platform that you're using. All of those things set your guest at ease, telling them this is how the podcast is going to go. Once we hit record, I'm going to introduce you. We're going to talk about your book. We're going to talk about your thing. And then at the end, we'll give you time to promote your website. Please feel free to do that. And then I'm going to close off with the last question at the end. And then we'll be done. Stick on at the end because I'd love to chat just before we go, just to make sure everything's all done, answer any questions, and we'll talk about what happens after the podcast. Let them know up front, this is where we're going. You're in charge. You're in control. You know what you're doing here. And you can do that right from episode 1. Have a plan, have a program to what you're going to do, and make your guests feel comfortable. You understand what you're doing. You got this. Your guest needs to feel comfortable as well. I always conduct a pre-interview. Now, there's a lot of feedback on this, whether or not that's a value add for your guest. But at the end of the day, having a guest on my podcast is not about the guest. It's not about me. It's about the listener. And if I can do a pre-interview with a guest and have a better recording that serves my audience in a deeper, more meaningful way, I'm going with the pre-interview. Now, a pre-interview can be on the same day as the recording, just before you hit record. Take a moment of time and 10, 15 minutes to talk about the show. That does value people's calendar. I get that. But for me, I like a break between a pre-interview and the actual interview because then I have time to go and hear my guest on other shows. I can go check out their Instagram. I can go listen to them on YouTube. I can go and research their website, read through their book. There's a lot of things I can do in preparation to the meeting that I can't do if I pre-interview and record in the same meeting. So for me, again, this is how I do it. There's no rules in podcasting. Do whatever works for you, but try doing a pre-interview and then a break for a few weeks and then coming back to them. It also gives them a chance to check you out. They may never have heard your podcast before. And when you do your pre-interview, invite them to listen to an episode so that you now have a new listener of your show by having a guest on your podcast. How do I get more listeners, Dave? Try getting more guests and inviting them to listen to your show. Isn't that how we do it? One by one, we get a new listener. They fall in love with you. You give them a great interview, a great podcast episode, and you now have a great contact that you can continue with on and a new listener for your show. It happens one by one, people. Have more guests if you want more listeners. That's how it works. It's not hard. It's easy. Do a pre-interview. It really does help. What else you can do? You can also just embrace the silence. Don't be afraid of brief pauses. They can give the guest time to respond and think of an answer, but they also allow your listener to catch up to the conversation. Your listener is like 1 or 2 sentences behind at all times. So you are listening to me talk about this right now, but you're thinking about what I just said a moment ago. So anytime you can give a break like this, allows for your listener to catch up to the conversation and feel like they're in step with you. You don't want to be so far ahead of your listener that they're running to catch up to you. You want to be able to slow down sometimes, throw in a break, throw in a pause, so that your listeners can catch up to the conversation, especially if you tend to speak fast. There's a lot of podcasters who talk very, 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 very fast, and it sounds like you're running down a hill trying to have a conversation. Slow down, Remember that your listeners are doing something else while they're listening, and they don't have the full attention to listen to you when you go too quickly. So take a break, slow down, add some pauses, some transitions. I do that in this episode. You're hearing them as you listen to this podcast. It allows your audience a break, a movement to the next section, and then they can follow along and feel like they're keeping up with you. Don't be afraid of silence. And be prepared to be flexible as well during your podcast. Research your guests thoroughly, but be willing to deviate from your planned questions, your list of questions in front of you, if the conversation goes in that direction. Your conversation may take an interesting turn where you learn something new about your guest that you were unprepared for, and you're like so curious you want to know more about that. Then go there. Scrap the questions and follow this conversation. That is probably one of the best tools for you as a podcaster that you can develop over time, where you follow the conversation, you don't lead the conversation. Okay? There's a difference. As well, encourage authenticity in everything that you do as a host and with your guests and with your listeners. Let your guests know that they don't need to perform or be overly formal, suit and tie, buttoned up, super serious. Authentic, natural conversations connect better with a listener than something that seems forced or fake. When you bring somebody on and they talk to you like this, as you talk to them, everything's cool, we're all great, the recording light comes on and they turn into, hey, everybody, all right, yeah, so come on, we're going to talk about the thing, and I'm a podcaster, yeah. What happened? What happened to you? Do you talk like that to your parents, to your family around dinner? No, you don't. So when I get really annoyed by people who sound fake and put on a persona, because they just really don't sound like that in real life. And I'm like, is that a nervous thing for you? So please, be you. Be the same you that I'm going to meet standing in line to get dinner at a podcast conference. Be the same person in line at Walmart. And I'm like, hey, you're the podcast person. You're the author. Nice to meet you. Be you. Be authentic. Also, show that you're on the same team with your guest. Help your guest understand that you want them to look good. For my Living the Next Chapter podcast, 3 years old, 450 plus episodes, I tell my guests, this podcast is about you. It is not about me. I am not an author as the host of that podcast. You're the author. You know more than I do. So my job is to bring people to you so you can sell more books. So my listeners, they're not experts. I'm not an expert. You're the expert. And I get some interesting looks from my guests, like, oh, I'm no expert. I tell them, well, you've written a book, which makes you an expert. And you've done something that I haven't done and what my audience hasn't done. So celebrate the expertise of your guest and make them look great on your podcast through your editing, through your questions, how you treat them, how you don't talk over them. That makes your guest look like a superstar. And you need to be committed to that in every part of your podcast. And as well, allow for mistakes. Remind your guests that this show isn't live. And again, I'll do an episode on live podcasting and why I just not a big fan. This isn't live. We're not in front of a live studio audience. You don't have to be perfect. If you need to pause, if you need a break, if you need a drink of water, if you want to redo a question and answer, I'm happy to do whatever makes you feel comfortable. So I want you to drop those shoulders down a little bit. You don't have to be perfect to be on this podcast, because I can prove to you many times that I am not perfect as the host. So relax. We're just having a conversation, and we can edit out anything you want, any tangents, anything you want. It can be fixed. Let's have a great conversation. Remind them that they don't have to be perfect. We can pause and restart this podcast at any point that they want to. It's all about the guest. So by simply implementing these strategies around creating a better engagement for your audience, for your guests and your audience by doing podcasting better and ditching active listening techniques for silent active listening techniques, we can make a better podcast for our community, for our guests. We can help us in our editing time. It'll help us, our listeners, to connect with our guests better and help us to conduct a more engaging and more insightful interview for everyone. If you need help with any of this, if you want to practice being a podcast host, interviewing a guest, maybe you've done a bunch of solo episodes, but you've never done an interview before, then reach out to me. I would love to be your interview test dummy. And whether you release the episode or not, that doesn't matter. But I would love to be there as a resource where you can practice being an interviewer. You can try doing the intro 10 times. You can ask me a question and say, was that a good question? You can do the outro three or four times and practice that. I'll show you maybe some things where you can improve and maybe try this for your show and give you the confidence to be a great interviewer for your first official real interview with your first real guest. You're not doing this alone. You have tools and people here to help you. Please leverage the tools and the people, with my hand raised, that will help you to feel more confident on the microphone, to be better equipped for your guest, and to do your best for your show. If you need any help, howtopodcast.ca is my website. There's a calendar link right there. And as well, as a listener to the show who's listened to this far, you know I'm going to mention there's also a link below, which is a calendar link just for my listeners for the podcast. It's not meant for everyone. It's not on my website. It's not on my social media. It's on this podcast because you're still here. If you want time with me one-on-one to ask me anything you want to ask me about, if you just need some inspiration, you need somebody to pump you up and show you that you're on the right path, to give you some thoughtful things to consider for your show, to maybe improve and make it better, then reach out to me through the link in the show notes. That's a link just for you. Just you. Anytime. Use it as often as you want. And it's time with me on my calendar for you to ask me anything about anything to do with podcasting. I would love to help you. Okay? Whether you have a show or you're thinking about having a show, whether you want to be a better podcast guest, whether you want to find a guest, there's so much we can talk about. And I'd love to be a resource for you as often as you wish. This is free. I'm not selling you anything. I don't have any programs. I don't have a book. I have nothing to sell you. It doesn't cost you any money to use the link. Please, if you need any help, use the link in the show notes. You'll see it if you scroll on your phone down to the bottom of the notes. There's the link. One click. You're in my calendar, and we'll set up time together. Okay? Howtopodcast.ca is the place to find everything about the show. And remember, there's also podcastforfree.com is my website where I list all the free options that I use to podcast. And if people tell you that free is a bad business model, then you can tell them to get off Facebook. Free is a good option for a lot of us as we're starting out and we're learning how to podcast. Podcastforfree.com is my website, and all my tools I use for free. I don't get paid for any of these tools. You can use the links there to find out more and make your podcast better. Thanks for listening, and I can't wait to hear your next interview. Send me a link. I'd love to listen to your show. Take care. Keep podcasting, everybody. Hit record. Take care. Hey, thanks for being here at the end of the podcast. This is just for you because you're still here. Thank you for your support for the podcast. Thank you for listening to the show, sharing it with other podcasters. Maybe somebody you know is thinking about starting a show. I would love for you to say, hey, wait. You should go check out the How to Podcast series. It's got everything you need. And Dave as well is included. You get one free Dave with the How to Podcast series. I'm included with it. So kind of a bundle thing you get. To that point, mentioning it in the podcast, definitely want to remind you here at the end, there's a link in the show notes. Starting it this summer, I'm working through this. It's a way for us, you and I, to have a conversation around podcasting. I want to help you. And I've been doing this for people who listen to the show now for almost 3 years. And I just haven't been promoting it as a thing. So I'm now promoting it as a thing. I want to spend time with you. I kind of would love to hear your voice. We're going to jump on Zoom together. We're going to talk about your podcast. You get time one-on-one with me, 30 minutes in my calendar, completely free, no strings attached. You don't have to buy a blender or a vacuum or none of that stuff. No. Just us. I just like to help you. And whether you're thinking about starting a show or you have a show, you want to grow your show, whatever it is, I'd love to meet you, talk about your struggles, your questions, work together. And I am eventually developing this into more of a coaching program for podcasters. But I'm starting with my best friends first, for free. So if you're interested, you listen to the show, and I appreciate you, link in the show notes. Let's get together and talk podcasting, okay? You and me, let's talk. Let's talk soon. See you. Thanks.